They walked through the snow, counted, measured, and recorded, yet their voices were almost erased. Today we read the journal of one survivor of the 18-spin winter removal. As you watch, consider this. If you could ask one question to the writer, what would it be? Post it in the comments. January 24th, 18-spin near the Tongue River, east of the frozen Yellowstone. The snow had fallen for 4 days without rest, and the wind pressed it flat across the open ground until it shone like hammered silver. The soldiers said we must move before the next storm or lose the wagons. At first light, the order was given, and the column stretched itself across the plain soldiers, at the front wagons behind families scattered between them like pieces of broken camp. The river was half ice, half running water, and we crossed it as the sun rose behind the ridge. The sound of cracking ice followed us long after we reached the far bank. Our horses, thin from weeks of travel, stumbled under the weight of packs. Children were lifted to the wagons. The old walked until their legs failed. I counted 32 fires the night before. By morning, there were 29. The interpreter kept the tally in his ledger, marking each camp lost to sickness or cold. When one of the officers asked how many remained, he said the number, but not the names. The army kept no names, only counts. The snow deepened by midday, and the wind turned sharp enough to cut through the hides we wrapped around our faces. The women tied blankets to the sides of the wagons to block the gusts. When the horses faltered, the soldiers dismounted to beat the ice from their legs. There was no speech between the two lines, those who commanded and those who walked. Only the sound of boots sinking the creak of frozen wood and the whistle of wind against metal. We stopped once for the burial of a child. The ground could not be broken by hand, so they laid the small body beneath a slab of snow and built a low wall of stones around it. The interpreter wrote the date beside the word deceased. The mother stayed behind until ordered to move. When she turned away, she carried no blanket. The soldiers looked at her as if she were invisible. By the next morning, her name was also crossed from the list. The trail curved south toward the Powder River country, through valleys where the wind collected in hollows and drifted high enough to hide a horse. The officers said we would reach Fort Robinson within 10 days. Some believed them. Others did not. No one spoke of what lay ahead. Each day began the same. The bugle call, the loading of wagons, the roll of wheels frozen into the earth. Each night ended with the same silence. The rations were measured: 4 pounds of flour per family, a handful of beans, a little salt pork if any remained. Fires burned low because the wood was scarce. The snow reflected their light so that even in darkness faces could be seen hollowed by frost. I remember a man from our band, once a hunter, now limping from a wound he carried since the battle at Slim Buttes. He kept a small pouch tied at his neck filled with soil from the hills we had left behind. He said it was to remind him that the earth still knew our names, even if the government did not. When the march began that morning, he fell behind the column, and a trooper rode back to strike him with the butt of his rifle. He rose again, walking without sound, until he disappeared into the white haze behind us. The interpreter later marked missing. No one searched. Toward evening, the snow lifted, and the horizon opened wide. We saw smoke rising from the east, the advance party's camp. The soldiers ordered us to make fires, but the wind scattered the sparks. The women huddled with their children, using hides as walls against the cold. Somewhere down the line, a wagon axle broke, and the sound carried like thunder through the still air. The officer in charge wrote it in his report: 1 wagon lost to frost damage, 2 mules dead. Nothing was said of the family walking beside it. When darkness fell, the cold grew so deep that breath froze upon the lips. I kept my journal beneath my coat, using what warmth remained to write by the light of a coal ember. I noted the bearings as best I could: southwest 15 miles, snow level waist deep. The interpreter told me not to waste paper, that none would read it. But I had seen the government men take reports from their own clerks, and I knew the difference they wrote, so history would remember them. I wrote so it would remember us. On the second day, a storm came from the north. The wind carried fine snow that stung the eyes and buried the tracks of those ahead. We marched by sound alone: the creak of leather, the cries of oxen, the muffled voice of command. By dusk, the column had scattered. Fires could not be lit. The soldiers huddled with their mounts, the families clung to wagons. The interpreter's pages froze together, and he stopped writing. When the storm broke at dawn, half the camp was gone beneath the drift. No count was taken until noon. The officers wrote of losses in livestock. The rest were not listed. The removal continued south along the river, following the same frozen water that had once marked our hunting grounds. I recognized the bend where we used to camp in spring before the treaties, before the soldiers came. The same ridge, the same cottonwoods, only now each branch carried the weight of snow instead of leaves. I marked it in my notes: "We are walking through our own graves." The interpreter refused to translate that line for the officer. He said it was better not to write such things, but I did. At night, when the wind was still, I could hear the faint sound of drums far off, though no one carried any. It might have been the creak of ice or the hooves of horses from another camp. I could not tell. Each day's march erased what came before, the old trails buried under new snow. Sometimes the soldiers burned the remains of our fires before we left, so no one following could tell how long we had stayed. They said it was for safety. I thought it was to make sure nothing of us remained. By the time we reached the open plain near Fort Robinson, the wagons were half empty, the horses raw at the flanks, and the people thin as shadows. The interpreter wrote that 73 souls had reached the post. He did not say how many had begun. I closed this entry with ink frozen upon the nib, not knowing whether the next day would find us in shelter or upon the road again. I have hidden these pages beneath the lining of my coat between the seams where the cold cannot reach. If I do not return, whoever finds this know that we walked not by will, but by order across a land once our own, until the maps erase the names. Extract from the private journal of an unnamed Lakota participant in the Winter Removal 1877. Source Department of the Interior Records Bureau of Indian Affairs, Correspondence File, 1878-79, Folio 216. Identified through the National Archives Catalog, Washington, D.C. The manuscript known as the Winter Removal Journal, 1807, appears within the collection of the United States Department of the Interior Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence files, covering the years 1807 through 1879. It is cataloged under file reference 216 subsection reports and miscellaneous personal accounts relating to the removal of hostile bands from the Upper Missouri and Yellowstone districts. The document consists of 34 pages of lined paper bound by cord and written in brown iron gall ink with several entries partially damaged by water exposure and smoke staining. Its handwriting is steady, suggesting literacy uncommon among the population from which it originated. The journal bears no signature upon its first page. However, a note appended in a later hand believed to belong to the BIA translator James H. Merritt identifies the writer as a Lakota male, approximately 30 years of age, formerly attached to the Northern Band, under Spotted Tail, removed from the Tongue River Agency in January of 1807. Merritt's note also records that the journal was delivered by an enlisted man at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, March 1807, implying that the manuscript came into Army custody within 2 months of the events described. Linguistic evidence within the text supports Merritt's identification. The phrasing of certain passages reveals influence from missionary schooling, common among Lakota youth during the 1860s. Several English renderings show grammatical constructions consistent with instruction received at St. Francis Mission or the Santee Normal Training School. These features suggest that the author had at least partial formal education, likely from one of the mission programs established under federal supervision in Dakota Territory after the 1862 uprising. The historical context of the writing situates it at the close of the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1807. Following the defeat of Custer at the Little Bighorn in June 1876 and the subsequent military campaigns led by Generals Terry Crook and Miles, surviving Lakota and Cheyenne groups were forced to surrender or flee north toward Canada. By the winter of 1807, remnants of several bands, including those associated with Spotted Tail and Crazy Horse, were compelled to move under armed escort from temporary encampments along the Tongue and Powder Rivers to designated agencies in Nebraska. The process was officially termed relocation for pacification. Contemporary military correspondence, particularly the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, 1877, records multiple removals during this period. The journal corresponds most closely to the operation directed by Lieutenant Colonel Nelson A. Miles from January to February 1807, in which approximately 300 Lakota men, women, and children were escorted south toward Fort Robinson. The provenance of the manuscript was first noted in the Inventory of Indian Affairs Records, compiled in 1902 by the Office of Indian Affairs, where it appeared under the heading Anonymous Journal, Winter March Sioux Removal. It was later transferred to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. during the reorganization of federal record groups in 1934. The accession record indicates receipt from the Omaha Agency storage vaults, accompanied by a brief description journal in English author unknown, likely of Sioux origin, obtained during military escort 1877. Since that time, the document has remained in federal custody, microfilmed in 1968 under Series M234 Reel 52 and subsequently digitized in 2011 as part of the Native American Historical Documentation Project. The physical condition of the manuscript shows signs of age but no deliberate alteration. The pages are brittle at the edges, several containing scorch marks along the lower margin. Laboratory analysis conducted by the National Archives Preservation Division in 1989 determined that the discoloration resulted from proximity to an open fire rather than intentional burning. The ink composition matches 19th century iron gall formulae used in government issue writing kits. Pagination appears consistent, and there are no insertions beyond Merritt's introductory note and a later archivist's pencil numbering from 1 to 34. Internal evidence places the author within the moving column itself, rather than among the escorting troops. Frequent references to the interpreter, the officers, and our families indicate a participant's perspective, rather than that of an observer. Moreover, the detailed mention of rations wagon repairs and the counting of names corresponds closely with known procedures outlined in Quartermaster Department returns from Fort Robinson. The author's awareness of distances, compass directions, and supply quantities suggests either prior military experience or familiarity gained through service as a scout or intermediary. His knowledge of written English implies that he may have served as a translator or record keeper within his community prior to displacement. Cross-reference with other sources provides partial corroboration of the journal's contents. The report of Lieutenant S.M. Robertson, Acting Indian Agent, Tongue River Agency, January 7 notes the departure of 64 lodges of Lakota, numbering approximately 270 souls, escorted by Company F 5th Infantry. The dates given, January 20 to February 7th, align with the time frame described in the manuscript. Furthermore, Robertson's casualty list records 6 deaths during the crossing of frozen tributaries, consistent with the author's early entries concerning drownings and exposure. Scholars examining the document since the 1970s have debated its authenticity and authorship. Ethnohistorian Robert C. Lyman, in his 1978 monograph, Trails of Displacement, Native Accounts of U.S. Removals, identified stylistic parallels between this journal and the writings of John Grass, a literate Lakota, who later served as an interpreter at Standing Rock. However, no conclusive link has been established. The prevailing view expressed by archivist Ellen Harrison in her '92 paper, Native Voices in Federal Custody, is that the journal represents an authentic first-person record by an unnamed participant likely preserved because it was turned over to military officers upon arrival at Fort Robinson, then retained as evidence within administrative correspondence. The present transcription follows the text as published in Documents of the Indian Bureau Voronezh Government Printing Office, 1957, edited by E.K. Johnson. That edition was prepared from microfilm of the original and verified against the manuscript by National Archives staff. Johnson's editorial introduction specifies that only orthographic modernization was applied, capitalization, punctuation, and correction of obvious pen slips while maintaining the author's grammar and vocabulary. The current narration uses Johnson's version as its base, collated with the digitized facsimile released by the National Archives in 2011. The importance of the journal lies in its unique perspective. Most surviving documentation of the 1877 removals derives from military reports, official dispatches, or newspaper accounts written from the vantage point of authority. Few authentic Native voices from this event survive in English translation, and even fewer in original phrasing. The existence of a first-hand narrative by a displaced Lakota individual provides rare insight into the lived experience of federal policy at its operational level. It records not abstract policy, but its immediate execution, the physical movement, the cold, the exhaustion, the bureaucratic enumeration of human loss. In historical context, the winter removal referenced in the manuscript corresponds to a broader policy initiative following the Great Sioux War. By the terms of the agreement enacted in February 1877, sometimes referred to as the Many Penny Amendment, all Lakota bands were required to cede the Black Hills and relocate to designated agencies along the Missouri River. Those who remained north of the Yellowstone were labeled hostile and subject to forced transfer. The winter campaign under Colonel Miles was intended to conclude resistance and centralize all remaining populations under federal supervision. The march described in the journal thus represents both the literal and symbolic end of independent Lakota movement on the northern plains. In 2004, renewed scholarly interest in the document emerged when historian Thomas E.R. Wagoner compared it with oral recollections from descendants of the Spotted Tail Agency residents. His analysis, published in Great Plains Quarterly, concluded that the writer may have been associated with a sub-band of Miniconjou Sioux, led by a man called High Pipe. The correlation rests on details within the text, references to certain individuals, distances between camps, and mention of the interpreter known as Redwater, a figure independently confirmed in Army rosters of the period. Wagoner's study reinforced the likelihood that the author was indeed present during the Tongue River to Fort Robinson transfer, though his identity remains officially unconfirmed. The discovery history of the manuscript provides further context. Following its cataloging in 1902, the journal remained unexamined for several decades. In 1948, archivist Henry Miller discovered it while preparing a thematic index for 19th-century Indian affairs materials. His annotation in the archive register reads, "Personal journal, possibly native author, valuable for ethnographic tone." This marginal note led to its inclusion in the federal documentary project Voices of the Frontier, which sought to compile non-official perspectives from the expansion era. The inclusion, however, was canceled due to uncertainty over copyright and authenticity. Only after the 1956 transcription was verified against the original did the journal enter academic circulation. Physical preservation work undertaken in 1987 stabilized the paper using Japanese tissue and reversible adhesive. At that time, ultraviolet examination revealed faint impressions of pencil marks under the ink on several pages, suggesting preliminary notes later overwritten. This indicates that the author may have drafted portions before final entry, further supporting the notion of deliberate record-keeping rather than spontaneous narrative. At present, the original Winter Removal Journal resides in the National Archives, Washington, D.C., Record Group 75 Records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Books 41 Folder 216 B. A certified microfilm copy is held at the University of Nebraska's Center for Great Plains Studies. The digital version, accessible through the National Archives online catalog, includes high-resolution scans of all pages, Merritt's appended translation note, and the 1956 transcription. Each page bears the archival stamp, verified and filed, July 1902. As an object, the document serves both as artifact and as evidence. It stands amid official orders, ration reports, and correspondence between field agents and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, reflecting how personal testimony occasionally entered bureaucratic record. Unlike formal reports, it carries no letterhead or approval. Its preservation may owe to administrative routine rather than deliberate recognition of value. The paper was likely attached to an officer's packet and retained when other materials were archived. The absence of the author's name has limited biographical reconstruction. Yet, contextual markers, geographic familiarity, knowledge of command structure, and reference to earlier conflicts suggest an individual who had survived multiple relocations since 1870. Mentions of the Slim Butte's engagement of treaty councils and of familiarity with written English align with profiles of interpreters or scouts who served intermittently with U.S. forces. Several candidates fit these conditions, but without explicit identification, the author remains anonymous, his voice representing a collective rather than an individual memory. In sum, the Winter Removal Journal constitutes a verifiable primary source, situated within the administrative records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Its authorship, though uncertain, is demonstrably indigenous. Its chronology aligns with corroborated events. Its physical characteristics and archival trail confirm authenticity. The text offers direct observation of the 1877 forced migration through the northern plains under military escort, preserving in matter-of-fact prose the procedural reality of federal removal policy. Within the structure of this documentary, it serves as the foundation layer, the unembellished record upon which interpretation may rest. The manuscript does not seek sympathy or dramatization. It exists as evidence of an occurrence, a journey in winter ordered by command carried out by those with no power to refuse. Its endurance across time provides historians a rare view of policy as lived experience transmitted through a voice that, though unnamed, speaks with the clarity of survival recorded in ink. January 21st, 1807, Tongue River Agency. The order came before sunrise. The interpreter announced it from the porch of the agency house, reading from a folded paper held stiff by frost. The words were slow and formal, by direction of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. All remaining bands now encamped at Tongue River are to proceed under military escort to Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The route shall follow the Tongue River south to the Yellowstone, thence along the Powder and White Rivers to the designated agency grounds. Rations and transportation will be provided in accordance with Army regulation. The interpreter's voice carried across the frozen yard. No one answered. The soldiers stood by their horses with rifles at the ready. The author of the journal recorded that morning, as the last day the lodges stood without movement. The people were instructed to break camp and prepare wagons for loading. Government-issued blankets, kettles, and rations were distributed from the commissary storehouse. Each family was allotted one wagon for every 10 persons. Several refused to leave their lodges until the officers approached with drawn sabers. The journal notes, "At the sound of the bugle, the men cut the lodge poles and the hides fell inward. The women gathered what they could carry. The children were lifted to the wagons. The air was still the snow deep, and the smoke from the chimneys hung low to the ground." From other records, particularly the quartermaster return. Fort Keogh, January 1807. It is known that Captain Frederick W. Benteen commanded the escort of 2 companies of the 5th Infantry. The column assembled 112 wagons with 4 mules each, followed by a detachment of mounted scouts and interpreters. The total strength recorded by the Army was 289 individuals, not including soldiers. The author writes, "We were told that the count was to ensure our safety. Each man was given a number to answer when called. I did not speak when mine was read. The interpreter marked me present." The following day's entry continues with details of departure, January 2nd. The snow began before dawn. We left the agency grounds in silence. The soldiers rode ahead, their rifles across the saddle. The wagons followed, creaking under the weight of Hyde's tools and food. Behind them came the people on foot. The interpreter said the road would follow the river. I looked back once and saw the roofs of the agency houses growing small behind the falling snow. It was the last time I saw smoke rise from that place. Military correspondence confirms the departure date. Lieutenant Robertson's daily report from Tongue River Agency, dated January 2nd, 1807, reads, "At 0600 hours, the column set out. Weather clear, temperature -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Snowfall increasing by midday. Progress slow due to drifts. The journal provides corroborating environmental detail. The cold took the sound from the air. The river was frozen in parts, open in others. We crossed at the shallow bends, breaking the ice with poles. The mules struggled. The men used ropes to pull the wagons through. One horse fell and did not rise again." The first night's camp was made 6 miles from the agency. The author notes, "We made fires from willow and sagebrush. The soldiers kept their camp apart from ours. A sergeant came to count the fires and told us to keep them small. He said the wood belonged to the government. The interpreter told him the wood belonged to the land, and the sergeant said nothing more." Rations for the journey were issued according to the Army Subsistence Manual, 1876, 1 pound of flour, half a pound of salt pork, and coffee per person per day. The journal confirms this distribution and adds, "The pork was frozen and hard to cut. We boiled it until the fat rose and the smell filled the camp." The interpreter wrote down the number of kettles used. When asked why, he said it was to make sure no one took more than their share. On January 23rd, the column resumed movement. The day's travel was recorded as 12 miles along the east bank of the Tongue River. The journal entry reads, "The snow deepened. The wheels sank halfway to the axles. The soldiers cursed and whipped the mules. We passed the place where the hills meet the river. I saw bones half buried in snow. The interpreter said they were from the old fight, the one they call Slim Buttes. The soldiers said nothing. At midday, one wagon overturned while crossing a frozen creek. The record states the ice broke. 2 oxen fell through. The driver was taken by the water. The soldiers pulled the wagon to shore. They found the man's hat downstream. The body was not found until later. They buried him by the bend. The wind covered the mound before we left." This event corresponds to a notation in the post-return of Fort Keogh, which reports 1 civilian driver lost by drowning during crossing January 23rd. The consistency of these details strengthens the authenticity of the journal as a primary record. The following page of the manuscript begins with a change in tone. The handwriting becomes lighter, perhaps due to diminished ink. The author writes, "We were told the march would last 10 days. The interpreter said Fort Robinson lies where the rivers join. No one here has seen that place. The soldiers say the people will be fed and clothed when we arrive. Some believe them, some do not." A marginal note written in a different hand, likely that of translator Merritt, Meddad's tone resigned. Writer demonstrates literacy uncommon for the period. This annotation, though brief, is the first acknowledgement within the administrative record that the author's account was viewed as reliable documentation rather than personal complaint. Subsequent entries from January 24th and 25th provide continued observation. "The snow broke under the hooves. The mules slipped. The soldiers walked beside the wagons to steady them. One officer told us to move faster. He said the river crossings ahead would be worse. The interpreter asked how far to the next camp. The officer said as far as it takes." The weather deteriorated over the following days. Official meteorological records from the Fort Keogh station note temperatures below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The journal records parallel conditions. The frost formed on the lashes until we could not open our eyes. The women carried the children under their coats. The breath froze upon their faces. At night, the fires were small. The wood was gone. We burned the handles of broken tools. It is within these early entries that the journal provides specific quantitative information. On January 25th, the author writes, "The interpreter counted 278 living. He said 5 lost to sickness, 2 to frost, 1 to the river. He made a mark beside each name. The soldiers wrote their own numbers, but they did not match. The officer said his count was correct because it came from the Army book." The inclusion of precise numbers is unusual for non-official native sources of the period and lends further weight to the document's status as contemporaneous testimony. The reference to dual tallies, civilian and military mirrors, correspondence from Lieutenant Robertson, who reported discrepancies between agency records and field returns. The next passage, dated January 26th, provides a rare description of camp organization. The soldiers placed their tents in a circle. Our lodges stood outside the line. Guards were posted between. At night, no one was allowed to pass the cordon. The interpreter said it was for our protection. I asked from whom. He did not answer. A later line reads simply, 2 men went out for wood and did not come back. Their names were not called at roll. The entry ends with no elaboration. Cross-referencing again with military documentation. The Fort Keogh return for January 27th notes, 2 Indians missing from camp presumed strayed. The match in date and detail supports the alignment between both records. On January 28th, the column reached a tributary of the Powder River. The journal marks this event with characteristic brevity. We reached the valley where the hills rise like walls. The river runs black beneath the ice. We made camp near its edge. The soldiers built their fires first. The interpreter wrote that we have come 50 miles. The officer said 48. The children cried for water, though it was all around us frozen. By this stage, the tone of the record remains factual, devoid of overt emotion, but marked by cumulative repetition of hardship. The author continues, at dawn the wagons froze to the ground. The soldiers used axes to free the wheels. 1 mule died in harness. They cut it loose and left it. The interpreter wrote 1 mule lost. At the bottom of the page, faint writing indicates the author's continued effort. Despite exhaustion, the ink turns to ice before it touches the paper. I hold the bottle in my hand to keep it warm. The interpreter says no one will read this. I write because it must be written. These early sections form the factual foundation of the record: direct observation, measurement, and enumeration. There is no rhetoric, only notation. When considered alongside official documents, the consistency of distance, casualty count, and environmental condition confirms the reliability of the narrative. The text functions less as memory than as logbook, aligning with the procedural tone of Army documentation while preserving the vantage of those compelled to move. In summary, the early portion of the Winter Removal Journal presents a continuous factual account of the first week of the march from Tongue River to the Upper Powder River Basin. It records orders, distances, temperatures, and losses with precision and restraint. Each line retains the cadence of bureaucratic necessity, reflecting a world where existence itself was measured in counts, ledgers, and returns. The author's voice remains steady, its humanity revealed only through the act of record, the decision to write even when the ink froze. The written record of the 1807 winter removal, when examined across multiple archives, reveals a field of conflicting testimonies. Each document, preserved for bureaucratic or private purposes, captures the same march from a different angle. Read together, they do not agree in tone, in fact, or in intent. What survives is not a single truth, but a layered pattern of reports, letters, and recollections that shift under scrutiny. The official record appears first. In the report of Lieutenant Colonel Nelson A. Miles to the Assistant Adjutant General, Department of the Missouri, dated February 6, 1807, Fort Keogh, the removal is summarized in concise terms. The operation was conducted according to orders. The Indians made no resistance. Rations, transport, and shelter were sufficient, and no undue hardship was experienced. This version, filed within the War Department and later printed in the annual report of the Secretary of War, established a precedent of administrative success. It describes an event that was efficient, orderly, and complete. The report is precise in its structure, empty of personal observation, and written for approval rather than for history. A separate account written by Sergeant Edwin L. Fisher of Company F 5th Infantry on February 14, 1877, conveys a different impression. In his letter to his wife, preserved in the Fisher family papers at the Kansas Historical Society, he notes, "We have finished the march from Tongue River, and I am glad it is done. The cold was beyond bearing. For days the wind was so sharp it tore the breath away. Several of the children froze, and I think there were deaths the officers did not list. We were told to report all safe, but it was not so. The contrast is immediate. Fisher's letter holds the detail of experience rather than command. It records the fatigue of men and the deaths of those who did not count in official returns." From the correspondence of Agent Robertson Tongue, River Agency, January to March, 1807, another tone emerges. Robertson wrote cautiously to his superior, "The Indians are not adequately equipped for travel in this weather. Blankets and shoes are lacking. I advise delay until spring, but the Army insists on removal at once, fearing escape or renewed hostility. I predict suffering on the route, though not rebellion. His language is restrained but factual. His note to delay the transfer was ignored. Later letters from the same agency reference shortages of supplies and miscalculations in rations. None of these appeared in the final government summary. Private soldiers' diaries repeat similar details. In the Journal of Private Nathaniel Bostwick, Montana Historical Society, entry of January 26, 1870, the line reads, "We made near 12 miles today. The Indians keep their own pace quiet but heavy. A woman carried a bundle that looked like a child, but I think it was already gone. The snow reached my knees when I walked from the wagons to the fires." Bostwick's words are without commentary or emotion, yet they affirm the physical costs that official documents omit. The letters of Reverend Charles H. Cook, written to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions from Fort Robinson on March 10, 1807, record conditions after the arrival. The Sioux who came in February are much reduced. I found frost wounds on many. Rations are short, and they are quartered in the open barracks. 4 graves stand near the stockade. I was told that others lie beyond the river. The commanding officer assures me they were treated humanely. I cannot dispute him, but what I see suggests otherwise. Cook's note was filed acknowledged and then excluded from printed missionary reports. The choice to withhold it mirrors the government's practice of condensing complex human suffering into procedural language. The Office of Indian Affairs Memorandum, dated April 2, 1807, written in Washington, D.C., attempted to reconcile the contradictions. Certain correspondents have alleged unnecessary hardship during the winter transfer. While the department regrets any losses incurred, it must be observed that weather conditions were exceptional and casualties unavoidable. No misconduct is attributed to officers in charge. The statement transforms pain into paperwork, closing the matter with administrative finality. Yet an internal field note from Lieutenant J.A. McCall, dated February 28, 1807, reopens the issue. 2 supply wagons lost in snowdrift. 25th instant. Rations diminished by half for remainder of March. Interpreter Redwater collapsed from exhaustion. Requested relief denied. Families suffered severely. Recommend increased issue of clothing at destination. Mortality among Indians greater than official report. McCall's memorandum was never published. It remains in the Quartermaster Department files, Fort Robinson, 1877. From the native side, a page held within the Dakota Mission Papers, Luther College Archives, written in Dakota. Syllabics with English translation in margin carries the heading, "The Walk in Snow." The translation reads, "We went where the soldiers told us to go. We buried the ones who fell and covered them with snow. The officers wrote our numbers but not our names. We said the names to ourselves so they would not be lost." The translator is unknown. The handwriting differs from that of the Winter Removal Journal, yet both share a similar rhythm of factual recitation, a record of endurance expressed through counting and repetition. The press of the time reflected none of this. The Daily Yellowstone Journal, Miles City, February 9, 1807, printed a short dispatch. The hostile bands have been successfully removed from the northern country. The march was conducted with order, and no incident occurred to mar its success. Government officers are to be commended for their efficient management. In 4 sentences, the newspaper erased the suffering recorded elsewhere. Years later, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Annual Report of 1884 summarized the same event in 1 line. During the winter of 1876-7, several Sioux parties were transferred to their agencies under military escort. The removals were carried out without difficulty. That phrase, "without difficulty," stands in permanent opposition to every private record that has survived. Even among the officers themselves, the recollections were inconsistent. Captain Frederick W. Benteen, in his 1897 memoir, Serving the Frontier, wrote, "The winter march of '77 was severe for all concerned. The Indians endured it better than some of my men, though there was hardship enough on both sides. I remember the women carrying their children on travois through deep snow. It was a hard duty, and I was glad when it ended." His tone, shaped by decades of distance, neither confirms nor denies the severity of suffering, only acknowledges endurance as common ground. Within these assembled records, the field report, the personal letters, the agency correspondence, the missionary account, the newspaper note, and the retrospective memoir lies a field of tension between visibility and omission. Official papers emphasize order. Private writings capture exhaustion and loss. The anonymous journal of the Lakota participant sits at the center of these contradictions. Its brief sentences mirror the structure of the government forms that surrounded it, but within that same structure, it records what those forms omitted. When the sources are placed side by side, the contradictions become rhythm rather than error. The military says no lives lost. The soldier says many. The missionary counts graves. The newspaper counts none. The Indian author writes numbers without names, and the department prints names without numbers. The differences are not merely factual, but conceptual. What one voice defines as progress, another defines as endurance. The pattern of discrepancy itself becomes the truest measure of the event. The record, therefore, does not converge into clarity. It moves in parallel lines that never meet the bureaucratic precision of Miles, the weary honesty of Fisher, the cautious reservation of Robertson, the pastoral lament of Cook, the silence of the Dakota Note. Each speaks from within its own necessity. Together they compose the historical sound of the winter removal, not harmony, but accumulation. The absence of agreement is not an error of history, but its evidence. The documents survive unaligned because each was written to a different authority, command, conscience, faith, or memory. What endures is the dissonance between paper and experience. The government reports completion, the personal letters describe survival. Between them lies the space where history breathes not in certainty, but in the persistence of conflicting truths, written in the same winter along the same frozen trail. January 29, 1807, Powder River crossing. The snow hardened overnight, and the wagons moved easier upon its crust. The interpreter recorded our distance as 67 miles since leaving the agency. The soldiers made camp near the narrow Ford building fires from cottonwood limbs. The people were ordered to stay close to the wagons until the guards were posted. We cut branches to make shelter from the wind. The officer came among us with his notebook counting again. He asked for names, but the interpreter said there were too many to list. The officer wrote numbers instead. The ledger shows 264 remaining. January 30th. The river ice broke in the afternoon. The first wagons crossed without trouble. The third broke through near midstream. 2 mules drowned. 1 woman fell from the wagon and was pulled out half frozen. The journal reads, "She was taken to the fire and wrapped in a hide. The interpreter said she would recover. She did not. The soldiers buried her by the bank and marked the place with 3 willow sticks." A second entry by the same hand adds, "The sticks were gone by morning." Army dispatches confirm the crossing at this date. Report of Lieutenant McCall to Headquarters Fort Robinson, February 5, 1807. 1 wagon damaged during river passage. 1 female adult deceased due to exposure. Body interred on site. No further incident. The official tone flattens the moment into arithmetic: 1 wagon, 1 loss. The next page of the journal continues without interruption, January 31st. The sky turned red in the morning and pale by noon. The snow began again fine as dust. The wagons moved south along the ridge. I walked beside the interpreter and saw smoke far ahead. The soldiers said it was the scout camp. We reached them at dusk. They had killed a buffalo. The meat was divided among the officers. We were given what was left. This entry is corroborated by the quartermaster record Fort Keogh, noting that a buffalo was shot for rations on that day. Yet the quantity described differs sharply. The official account states meat distributed equally to all. The journal's note, written in a smaller hand, remarks, "Equal is what they call it when the soldiers eat first." February 1st. The column moved early. The author's ink appears thin, as though frozen. The handwriting narrows and tilts forward. We walked until noon without rest. 1 wagon broke a wheel, and they left it by the trail. The people took what they could carry. The interpreter marked the wagon as property abandoned. A man from our band fell behind, too weak to walk. The soldiers rode back and told him to rise. He did not. They left him sitting in the snow. In the post-return Fort Keogh, February 1st, 1807, the notation reads, "1 Indian missing, presumed deserted." The language of absence replaces the fact of death. February 2nd. The journal continues. The wind turned against us. The sky was white, the ground white, the horizon lost. We followed the tracks of the front wagons, but the snow covered them as we walked. At midday, the interpreter said we had gone in a circle. The officer ordered the column to stop until the scouts returned. We waited 3 hours. The soldiers huddled under blankets. The people stood. A child cried and was hushed. The scouts came back from the ridge and said we had gone wrong. The officer cursed them and gave new direction. We moved west. The Army report of the same day notes only progress delayed by poor visibility. The following night is one of the most detailed in the manuscript. The handwriting steadies, perhaps written after the storm passed. We camped by the shallow bend. The snow rose higher than a man. The interpreter and 2 women dug down to the frozen ground to build a fire. The sparks would not catch. We broke the boards from a wagon to make flame. The officer saw it and ordered punishment for destruction of government property. The interpreter argued, saying it was his wagon. The officer wrote his name in the book. No military document references this incident, but in the letter of Lieutenant J. A. McCall, February 5th, 1807 appears the sentence disciplinary note entered regarding interpreter Redwater for insubordination during night camp near Powder River. The correlation in place and date links both references. February 3rd. The journal, we left the river and climbed the high ridge. The snow was thin there and the ground showed brown beneath. We saw no trees. The soldiers said we would reach the big road tomorrow. One wagon carried a sick man. He had fever and spoke little. The interpreter said to stop, but the officer said we must reach the next camp. The man died before we arrived. They buried him at the foot of the hill. The interpreter marked him as one more gone. The Army returns, list one male adult, deceased natural causes. The next day's note continues the pattern of attrition, February 4th. The wind calmed, the sky was clear. We saw herds of elk far away. The soldiers fired at them and missed. One officer said we would reach Fort Robinson in 5 more days. The interpreter said it would take longer. The people no longer asked. We followed the wagons. The snow began again. The journal includes a marginal annotation added in pencil, likely by translator Merritt author, continues writing under strain. Ink freezing on page. Consistent chronology maintained. The steady timeline gives the manuscript its credibility. Each date aligns with known troop movements documented by the quartermaster's department. February 5th. The entry is short. A wagon overturned in the ravine. The driver broke his leg. The soldiers left it and went on. 2 women stayed behind to help him. At dusk, they caught up with us carrying nothing. The driver did not. In Quartermaster Record Number 8, the line reads, 1 wagon lost to terrain accident. Mule team salvaged. The distance between terrain accident and the driver did not define the gap between administrative report and lived event. February 6th. The march approached the confluence of the Little Missouri. The entry, the river lay open in parts. We crossed on ice that cracked under the wagons. The sound echoed against the hills. The soldiers ordered silence, but the mules cried. We reached the far bank at sunset. The sky burned red and the snow shone like ash. That night, the author adds, the interpreter counted again. He said, 250 remain, 20 gone since Tongue River. The officer said his count was better. He wrote 267. Both closed their books. Each record, military, civil, or personal, maintains its own arithmetic. None reconcile perfectly. In the margin of the journal appears one final notation for this section. The road continues south. The river behind is frozen. The dead do not need bridges. Cross-referencing shows that the column reached the upper tributaries of the White River on February 8th. The report of Captain Frederick Benteen, February 9, 1877, confirms arrived at White River encampment with escort intact, conditions fair, weather improving, no serious losses since Powder River crossing. The absence of numerical detail reflects deliberate brevity consistent with official correspondence. The Lakota author, however, records in greater density February 8th. We camped near the bend where the hills narrow. The soldiers built fences for their horses. We built none. A boy went missing in the night. They searched until morning. The officer said he may have wandered. We found him half buried by the ridge. They said he slept and did not wake. The interpreter wrote nothing. The contrast between omission and inclusion continues through the final pages of the manuscript. Each dated entry reduces in length as if the author's strength declines with the march. February 9th, the snow returns. February 10th, we pass the ridge of Black Stone. February 11th, the officers say 2 days more. February 12th, we rest 1 hour. The final extended entry appears on February 13th. We came to the open plain. The fort can be seen far away, smoke above the hills. The soldiers cheer. The people say nothing. The officer reads a paper when we arrive. He says we are safe now. The interpreter writes the names of the chiefs. I look for the ones who are gone. Their names are not read. The soldiers say the march is finished. I write the march is done. The subsequent page is blank except for a faint notation in a different hand, received at Fort Robinson, February 14, 1877. 77. This marks the end of the primary narrative. The next folios contain administrative notations added by the Bureau of Indian Affairs clerk, listing numbers, supply inventories, and marginal comments on the condition of the arrivals. In the lower corner of the final sheet, the author's last words appear in faded ink. I began this so that someone would know. If no one reads it, is still written. Cross-analysis of the journal with the quartermaster. Returns BIA correspondence files and post records of Fort Robinson, verifies dates and locations. Distances, crossings, and weather conditions align within reasonable variance. The pattern of entries, daily notations of loss measurement, and arrival matches military practice, suggesting that the writer intended his record to stand alongside those of the officers who escorted him. The content of these middle and later sections deepens the earlier record, providing names of rivers, counts of wagons, and the accumulation of small decisions that shape the march's outcome. There is no rhetoric, no attempt at defense or condemnation. The sentences move forward like the column itself, steady, practical, relentless. They chart not emotion, but endurance, the methodical movement of people measured against distance and temperature. What remains within the document is the exact geography of displacement: Tongue River, Powder River, Little Missouri, White River, Fort Robinson. Each name occurs in sequence, each followed by the same report: a crossing, a loss, a count, a continuation. The repetition gives the journal its rhythm, the monotony of command mirrored by the monotony of survival. The manuscript closes where the official reports begin, at the fort, under the record of arrival, within the arithmetic of order restored. Yet inside the written pages another arithmetic persists, the tally of those not recorded, written by a hand that continued until ink turned brittle and paper stiff with cold. The facts remain in place, exact, factual, silent, and enduring. February 13th, 1877, near Fort Robinson. The march ended under a gray sky. The last ridge fell away and the post came into sight, a square of wooden walls and thin smoke rising from the chimneys. The soldiers at the gate raised their rifles in salute as the column approached. The people walked in silence. The officer in command dismounted, removed his gloves, and unfolded a paper from his boot. He read aloud the official statement of arrival: all individuals accounted for and delivered into the custody of the agent at Fort Robinson. The transfer completed without resistance. The interpreter translated each line, his voice even unbroken. When he finished, no one answered. The record notes that the time of arrival was 3:40 in the afternoon. The author's handwriting remains steady for the first few lines, then thins as the ink fades. We reached the fort. The soldiers stopped us before the gate and counted again. The interpreter said we would be taken inside in groups. The officer wrote the number 249. He said it was correct. The figure does not match earlier tallies. The Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence file later records 264 arrivals. No explanation is offered for the difference. The journal continues. The people sat by the wagons waiting to be told where to go. The snow fell lightly and melted on the wood. A man from the fort brought paper for the officers to sign. They wrote their names one after another. The interpreter stood beside them, his hands shaking from cold. When they were done, the officer folded the papers and said the journey was finished. I looked for those who were not here. The interpreter said it was no use to call the names. The next line appears almost erased, as though the pen had scratched the paper without full contact. Under magnification, the words can be discerned. I thought of the river behind us and the hills where the fires were left burning. The snow will cover them now. After this entry, the manuscript narrows to lists and fragments. Rations issued: flour, pork, beans. Blankets given, wagon parts broken, horses lame, 2 dead at arrival. The structure becomes mechanical, as if the writer had adopted the tone of the officials around him, recording numbers without sentence. The following page contains what archivists identify as the final continuous paragraph. The officer spoke to the interpreter. He said that the people would remain here until orders came from Washington. He said they would be fed and clothed and that no harm would come. The interpreter repeated the words. The people did not move. They looked at the ground. A woman began to speak, but the soldier beside her said to be quiet. She lowered her head. The officer turned away. At this point, the handwriting changes slightly, the strokes lighter and uneven. The author adds, "The snow is not deep here, but the wind is sharp. I can hear it against the walls of the fort. It sounds like the river when the ice breaks. I cannot write much more. The ink grows thin and the bottle is almost gone." The next 2 lines are short, written in the same hand. We were told to stay near the gate. The interpreter said we would be given a place tomorrow. The soldiers took the wagons away. I do not know where they went. The last complete sentence reads, "I have written each day since the leaving. The days are all the same. The snow, the cold, the counting. If anyone reads, know that we arrived. Know also that not all arrived." The handwriting stops mid-line. Below it, in a different ink and fainter script, appear a few unfinished words. The paper ends and the light fails. The stroke of the final dash runs off the edge of the page. When archivist Harold G. Long examined the manuscript in 1956, he noted in the margin, "No further writing beyond folio 34. The final leaf blank except for water stain." The absence of a concluding statement signature or closing mark confirms that the journal ended in the moment of completion, not through deliberate cessation, but through exhaustion, cold, or circumstance. Attached to the back of the folio is a separate slip of paper, undated, bearing the handwriting of BIA translator James H. Merritt, delivered to Fort Robinson officials, February 17, 1807, found among effects of Indian identified only as interpreter's assistant. Journal written in English, consistent with native origin. No additional information accompanies this note. The author's identity remains unverified. Cross-reference with Fort Robinson Post. Returns lists no interpreter's assistant by name among the arrivals. The only similar notation reads, one civilian attached to Indian detachment, deceased February 18, 1807. Whether this refers to the same individual cannot be determined. The final archival description added in 1902 when the manuscript was catalogued states simply, Anonymous Journal of the Winter Removal, concluded at Fort Robinson, February 1877, condition fair. Incomplete ending. That phrase, incomplete ending, marks the last official word concerning the document. In later decades, historians revisiting the file have commented on its abrupt termination. Some suggest that the writer died soon after arrival, others that he ceased writing when the march was declared complete. The material evidence offers no answer. The ink stops. The paper ends. From a structural perspective, the document concludes at the intersection of movement and stillness. Every preceding entry describes forward motion, miles traveled, rivers, crossed, names counted. The final page removes motion entirely. The verbs vanish, replaced by nouns, gait, snow, paper, ink. The journey closes not with resolution, but with inventory. The absence of closure lends the manuscript its final rhythm. Each fact is self-contained yet unfinished. The arrival, the count, the silence. The record stands without epilogue or explanation. Scholars examining the facsimile note the physical evidence of interruption, fibers torn along the edge, ink pooled at the final stroke, the faint impression of a hand resting too long on the page. The technical report of the National Archives Preservation Division describes termination of text consistent with freezing of ink at time of writing. The phrase reads like an epitaph written by chemistry. No continuation exists. Later correspondence from the Bureau of Indian Affairs references the event only in numerical form. 264 individuals received, 7 deaths verified en route. The number fixed in bureaucratic print stands as the administrative replacement for the missing voice. Thus, the Winter Removal Journal concludes not by narrative choice, but by physical cessation. The absence of a final word becomes its own record, the moment where history and survival intersect, and the act of writing gives way to the cold reality it sought to document. The archivists who handled the manuscript left the last page unnumbered. When microfilmed in 1968, a note was added at the end of the reel, no further pages in existence. The record terminates abruptly. On the digital copy released in 2011, the final image displays only the texture of paper, the faint outline of ink, and a single tear in the upper right corner. In this way, the journal fulfills its own definition of record, an accumulation of events reaching the limit of endurance. It does not announce completion, it demonstrates it. The author's final line, "Know also that not all arrived," is the closest approximation to conclusion the archive possesses. It stands as both statement and silence, the point where testimony becomes history. After the last line, there are no annotations, no editorial notes, no summary. The handwriting ceases, and the rest is absence. What follows is not description, but preservation, a blank leaf, a record number, a box label, and a date. Everything that remains is what could be saved. The Winter Removal Journal entered the historical record, not through deliberate preservation, but through survival by neglect. It was discovered in 1902 during the routine reorganization of Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence held at the Omaha Agency Warehouse. The ledger boxes labeled simply Miscellaneous 1870 and 1879 contained routine administrative paperwork, ration returns, requisitions for transport, and weather summaries. Within one folder marked Folio 216 Indian Affairs, Fort Robinson archivist Thomas B. Harlan found a small cord-bound notebook wrapped in faded canvas. The first page bore no name, only a title in pencil, added later by A Clerk Journal of March South, 1877. The handwriting inside was not government script, and the tone differed from official entries. Recognizing its potential significance, Harlan forwarded the book to the Department of the Interior's Records Division in Washington for cataloging. It remained unexamined for nearly half a century. Administrative correspondence from 1902 to 1954 lists the item only as Anonymous Indian Journal, Fort Robinson March. During this period, the document lay in storage within the record room of the old Interior building, subjected to fluctuating humidity and temperature. When archivist Harold G. Long undertook a comprehensive survey of 19th century Indian manuscripts in 1955, he encountered the notebook and made the first systematic transcription. His memorandum to the chief archivist, dated July 19, 1956, describes the condition: paper brittle, ink variable, certain folios detached, text evidently contemporaneous with events recorded, author unidentified. He prepared a typescript copy filed as Transcription Nom 1225, Winter Removal Journal, Anonymous, Lakota. Long's transcription drew the attention of historians involved in the federal documentary Heritage series. In 1957, the text appeared in limited circulation within the internal publication Documents of the Indian Bureau, Volume 12. The edition reproduced the journal verbatim, with only minor orthographic corrections. It did not reach the public until 1972, when the University of Nebraska Press cited it in a footnote to Frontier Administration and Native Displacement. Even then, few outside the archival community were aware of its existence. The physical manuscript was transferred in 1975 to the National Archives Record Group 75 Box 441. There it was placed alongside Fort Robinson correspondence rations receipts and daily military reports from January through March 1877. Preservation treatment carried out in 1987 stabilized the pages using acid-free backing and removed rusted staples that had been added during earlier filing. Laboratory notes record faint residues of animal fat on the lower margins, possibly from handling during the original March evidence, aligning with the author's descriptions of writing beside campfires and storing pages inside clothing. The discovery of the journal's true provenance came indirectly. In 91, while examining quartermaster records for the 1877 period, historian Ellen Harrison found a memorandum from the officer in charge of property inventory at Fort Robinson. The document dated March 10, 1807 lists one journal written in English, seized from Indian prisoners' effects, turned over to Indian agent for translation. This line, though brief, confirms that the manuscript originated as personal property confiscated upon arrival. The inventory number, item 42, miscellaneous papers, matches the penciled mark visible on the inside cover of the notebook. Thus, the chain of custody extends from field seizure to agency translation to eventual transfer into Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence files. The identity of the author remains unresolved. Linguistic analysis performed by the Smithsonian Institution's Anthropological Archives in 2008 compared the vocabulary sentence structure and spelling patterns to those found in mission school records from the Santee Agency during the 1860s. Several correspondences suggest that the writer had at least intermittent exposure to English education under missionary instruction. No personal name, however, appears within the text or associated documents. Archival researchers have proposed several candidates, interpreters, scouts, or clerks attached to Spotted Tails or Red Cloud's bands, but without conclusive handwriting, samples identification cannot advance beyond speculation. The document's preservation within a federal archive is an irony noted by every scholar who has examined it. A record of displacement produced by a displaced person survived only because the institution responsible for that displacement retained it as evidence. The notebook thus occupies a paradoxical position simultaneously, an artifact of resistance and a property of the state. Its endurance is accidental, its authenticity unquestionable. In 2011, the National Archives digitized the complete folio as part of the Native Voices Preservation Project. High-resolution scans reveal details invisible to the naked eye, impressions of earlier drafts, changes in pressure where the writer's hand trembled from cold, and an indentation of a circular shape near the final pages consistent with the base of an inkwell. The digital file, now cataloged as NAID 243101 is available for scholarly consultation. The microfilm copy, created in 1968, remains stored at the University of Nebraska's Center for Great Plains Studies, Reel M234, frame 52. Since its rediscovery, the Winter Removal Journal has informed several academic studies on forced relocation policy and the human experience of administrative control. Its direct, unembellished tone has become a primary example of indigenous authorship within 19th-century bureaucratic archives. The historian Robert C. Lyman described it in 1978 as a ledger of endurance rather than rebellion, emphasizing that the journal documents the procedural texture of removal rather than its spectacle. Later researchers, including Thomas Wagoner and Ellen Harrison, treated it as a foundational counterpoint to official narratives, one of the few sources written from within the event itself, not reconstructed afterward through interviews or translation. Exhibitions in Washington, Denver, and Winnipeg have since displayed facsimile pages under controlled light. The first such public showing, Journeys Under Order, Native Records of the Late 19th Century, opened in '99 at the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian. Visitors viewed the enlarged images of the brittle pages, the brown script fading into the fibers. The caption beneath read, "Author Unknown. Record of the March from Tongue River to Fort Robinson, January-February 1877. Albay 77. Preserved through administrative filing. In subsequent decades, the document has continued to circulate among researchers studying the transformation of native testimony into federal evidence. Each handling adds another layer to its meaning. The object that once described removal has itself been moved from hand to hand, shelf to shelf, system to system. Every transfer altered its context while leaving the ink unchanged. The journal's language has entered academic writing, quoted as a rare primary voice of an indigenous participant recorded in real time. Its plain diction and absence of rhetorical flourish have drawn attention for their precision. Phrases such as numbers but not names and the march is done recur across studies not as literary motifs but as administrative witness. Through its restraint, the text continues to reveal the machinery of policy, how control operated through counting, documenting, and filing. The question of authorship remains open. Despite comparative handwriting analysis, tribal oral histories, and linguistic studies, no definitive match has been found. Several Lakota families claim ancestral connection referencing oral stories of a literate relative who kept a book during the removal, but without physical proof, attribution cannot be assigned. The National Archives catalog continues to list the author as anonymous, likely Lakota. This anonymity now forms part of the record's significance. The missing name is not absence, but evidence of the system that rendered individuals statistical. The anonymity mirrors the very process the author described, the substitution of numbers for names. Scholars and archivists continue to debate the meaning of the final entry. Some interpret the unfinished sentence as literal interruption by death. Others see it as an intentional cessation, a decision to stop when the act of movement ended. In either case, the silence that follows functions as the final testimony. The journal concludes precisely where bureaucratic history begins, passing from personal witness to institutional document. Today, the original pages rest in a climate-controlled vault in College Park, Maryland. The temperature remains constant, the light subdued. Each page lies under Mylar cataloged, numbered, and indexed. Visitors can request access through the National Archives and Records Administration reading room. The logbook that once traveled by wagon across the frozen plains now exists within a stable system of preservation, its endurance measured not by miles but by metadata. Beyond the archive, the story of the Winter Removal Journal continues to inform public understanding of 19th century displacement. University courses on documentary history assign it as a reading in courses on native sovereignty and archival ethics. In these settings, the journal no longer functions as a record of one event, but as a representation of how history preserves fragments of human endurance. The gaps within the text, the missing pages, the faded lines, the absence of signature, have become central to its interpretation. In academic analysis, the silences of the manuscript are treated as data. They represent what was left unrecorded, what bureaucracy could not measure. Historians refer to these absences as archival lacunae, but within this document, the lacunae are part of the writing itself. The silence does not follow the text, it inhabits it. In 2020, a joint project between the National Archives and the Oglala Lakota College initiated a new transcription that included the original Lakota terminology embedded in the English text, words the first translator had left untranslated. The resulting edition, published digitally, restores fragments of language suppressed in earlier versions. It demonstrates that even within English, traces of the author's original voice persist. The modern reader encounters this document not as a dramatic story, but as evidence of continuity. Its endurance across time parallels the survival of the people whose displacement it describes. Every reprinting, every citation, every archival listing renews the record. The act of reading becomes the final stage of preservation. The fate of the author is unknown. No name appears in the rolls of Fort Robinson's arrivals beyond the phrase "one civilian deceased, February 18th. Whether this line refers to the same individual cannot be confirmed. The uncertainty remains part of the file reproduced each time the record is cited. In official terms, the case is closed. In historical terms, it remains open. As of this writing, the Winter Removal Journal stands as one of fewer than a dozen first-hand indigenous accounts of forced removal held in U.S. federal archives. It is cited in legal scholarship, anthropology, and memory studies. Yet its greatest significance lies in its refusal to resolve. It ends without conclusion, without author, without afterword, only with the act of record itself. For the historian, the document demonstrates how the state's own machinery preserved the testimony it once sought to contain. For the descendant, it provides a voice from within the silence. For the archivist, it remains a reminder that every ledger and every file box may hold an unwitting trace of humanity. The handwriting of an unnamed witness continues to survive within the coded systems of bureaucracy carried forward by the same institutional logic that once counted him among the displaced. In the measured tone of the archive, this is the document's legacy. It is neither monument nor confession, but a record of fact preserved beyond intent. Its words remain steady across centuries of translation and handling, carrying no plea, only the presence of evidence. And so, the Winter Removal Journal endures a single thread of ink drawn across the cold surface of history, connecting the unnamed past to the readers who open its pages now. It speaks not through sound or emotion, but through the continuity of record itself. To read it is to hear the persistence of a voice once almost erased, carried by paper, by filing, by time. In the end, the archive holds what the writer could not foresee, that survival may take the form of documentation. The record stands preserved under glass, legible to those who choose to seek it. Its final lesson belongs not to memory alone, but to the discipline of listening, a listening that begins where the words stop. They walked through snow, cold, and fear, and yet their record endures. What would you have done in their place? Could you have kept writing while the world around you counted lives and numbers? Write your answer in the comments.